"You're not on the list, sir. Step away from the gate." The voice was firm, practiced, and just loud enough to turn heads across the neatly arranged rows of folding chairs. The morning sun hung bright over the academy field, glinting off polished shoes and pressed uniforms. A sea of proud families gathered to watch a new generation step forward. And just outside the designated seating area, standing alone on the gravel path, was Arthur Hayes. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. His hands rested loosely at his sides, fingers worn and steady, as if they had learned long ago that force was rarely the answer. His suit was old, dark gray, slightly faded at the cuffs, but clean, carefully pressed, the kind of suit a man kept for moments that mattered. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the stage in the distance, where rows of cadets sat waiting, one of them his grandson. "I said step back," Officer Mark Reynolds added, moving closer now, his posture rigid, his authority worn like a fresh badge that hadn't yet seen doubt. He was young, mid-20s at most, his uniform sharp, his tone sharper. To him, Arthur was just another problem, an unverified presence at a controlled event. Around them, a few parents began to whisper, their voices low but curious, glancing between the old man and the officer as if trying to piece together a story from fragments. Arthur finally shifted his gaze, not to the officer, but past him, toward the rows of families seated inside. "I'm here for my grandson," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that didn't need volume. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, impatient. "Then you should have checked in like everyone else. This area is restricted." He gestured toward the entrance with a curt flick of his hand, already expecting compliance. But Arthur didn't move. Not forward. Not back. He simply stood there, the wind brushing lightly against his jacket, the distant hum of the ceremony beginning to rise as the band tuned their instruments. There was a stillness about him, something that didn't match the situation, something that made the officer's irritation sharpen into something closer to discomfort. Reynolds stepped in closer, lowering his voice. "Sir, you're creating a disruption." The words were controlled, but there was an edge now, a need to assert control before the moment slipped further. Arthur's eyes drifted again, this time, catching a glimpse of a young cadet adjusting his cap in the front rows. For just a second, something softened in his expression, pride, quiet and unspoken. Then it was gone, replaced by the same calm, unreadable presence. Behind Reynolds, the ceremony announcer's voice echoed faintly over the speakers, calling for attention as the first names were about to be read. The timing couldn't have been worse, or more perfect. And still, Arthur Hayes did not move. The band struck its first note, a low brass hum that rolled across the field like distant thunder, and the crowd instinctively straightened in their seats, conversations dissolving into a respectful silence. But at the edge of it all, the tension remained, sharp and unresolved, as Officer Reynolds shifted his stance, planting himself squarely between Arthur and the entrance, his polished shoes grinding lightly against the gravel with each subtle adjustment, as if even the ground resisted the moment. "Sir, this is your final warning," he said, his voice no longer loud but tighter, controlled in a way that suggested he was now aware of the eyes on him, aware that this was no longer just a routine enforcement of rules, but something unfolding in public view, something that could not be easily undone. Arthur did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting once more toward the stage where rows of young men and women sat in perfect formation, their uniforms crisp, their futures just beginning to take shape. And somewhere among them, Ethan Hayes sat waiting, unaware that just beyond the boundary of celebration, his grandfather stood being quietly removed from the moment they were meant to share. A flicker of movement caught Arthur's eye as Ethan adjusted his posture, scanning the crowd for a familiar face, his expression subtle but searching, and for the briefest second, their lines of sight nearly met, separated only by distance and circumstance. Reynolds followed Arthur's gaze, misreading it as hesitation. "If you have a family member here, you can wait in the designated area outside the perimeter," he added, gesturing toward a section far from the ceremony, a place where the view was obstructed and the connection distant. "Those are the rules," he finished, the words landing with the finality of something he believed could not be challenged. Arthur inhaled slowly, the air warm with the scent of freshly cut grass and sun-warmed fabric, a familiar kind. of mourning, the kind that should have been simple, proud, complete, and yet here it stood, fractured at the edges. "I have waited in worse places," he said quietly, not as a challenge, not even as a protest, but as a statement of fact, something that seemed to pass right through Reynolds without leaving a mark, or so it appeared, because for a fraction of a second, the officer's expression faltered, just enough to reveal uncertainty before it was quickly replaced by reinforced authority. He reached out then, not aggressively, but with intent, guiding Arthur a step back from the entrance, a small movement, almost insignificant, but one that drew a few more glances from nearby families, whispers tightening into something closer to discomfort. And still, Arthur allowed it, his shoes shifting softly against the gravel, his posture unchanged, his silence intact, as if the moment itself did not require resistance, only endurance. Behind them, the announcer began calling the first names, each one echoing across the field, each one met with applause, a rhythm of pride building with every step forward. And as the line of cadets began to move, Ethan's name approached, carried somewhere within that sequence, closer with every passing second, and just outside the boundary, Arthur Hayes stood, unmoving, watching, waiting, as the distance between where he stood and where he was meant to be felt greater than any measured space could explain. Arthur Hayes. The name carried across the field, clear and resonant through the speakers, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single sound, the syllables hanging in the air just long enough to settle into something deeper than recognition, because it was not the name of the cadet being called, not yet, but something else entirely, something spoken quietly behind the scenes by a voice that did not belong to the ceremony, a voice on a phone held low and tight by Captain Daniel Brooks as he stood just beyond the seating rows, partially turned away from the crowd, his expression no longer neutral, no longer detached, but sharpened by a growing certainty that something here was not as simple as it appeared. He had been watching from the moment the old man was stopped, not out of curiosity at first, but out of instinct, the kind that came from years of service, from learning to read what was not said as much as what was. And there had been something in the way Arthur stood, something in the stillness, in the restraint, that did not match the picture of a confused guest or an uninvited presence. It was the kind of stillness he had seen before, in places far from polished fields and formal ceremonies, places where silence was not emptiness but control. Brooks turned slightly, glancing back toward the gravel path where Arthur now stood a few steps removed from the entrance. Officer Reynolds still positioned near him, watchful, firm, unaware that the situation had already begun to move beyond him. Brooks lowered his voice into the phone. "I need you to run a name," he said, his tone careful, measured, as if each word carried weight he could not yet fully explain. There was a pause on the other end, the faint sound of keys, of someone humoring what might have seemed like an unnecessary request. "Arthur Hayes," Brooks repeated, his eyes drifting down, catching sight of something that had gone unnoticed by most, a faint marking just visible beneath the cuff of Arthur's sleeve as the fabric shifted slightly in the breeze. Not a decoration, not something new, but something worn into the skin itself, aged, faded, deliberate. Brooks did not recognize it fully, not the design, not the meaning, but he recognized what it represented, the kind of mark that was not given lightly, the kind that belonged to a time and place that did not make it into official briefings. The line on the other end of the call went quiet for a beat longer than expected, then longer still, and when the voice returned, it had changed, the casual tone replaced by something sharper, more alert. "Say that name again," the voice asked. Brooks did, slower this time, and as he spoke, his eyes lifted toward the stage where the ceremony continued uninterrupted, cadets stepping forward one by one, applause rising and falling in steady rhythm. Ethan Hayes now only a few names away, unaware of the shift happening just beyond the edge of the moment meant for him. Brooks listened, his posture tightening as the response came through, not in full sentences, but in fragments, confirmations, questions layered over each other, and then one word, spoken clearly, deliberately, confirmed. Brooks exhaled slowly, the air leaving him in a controlled release, his gaze returning to Arthur, who had not moved, who had not spoken again, who simply stood there as if time itself had slowed around him. "Who do I notify?" Brooks asked, already knowing the answer would not be small. The reply came without hesitation this time. Immediate, direct, stand by. And then the line went silent again, not disconnected, just waiting. And in that waiting, something shifted in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm changes direction. Officer. Reynolds adjusted his stance once more, glancing briefly toward Brooks without understanding why the captain was now watching so closely, why the atmosphere felt heavier than it had just minutes before. And across the field, the announcer's voice rose again, calling the next name, the cadence steady, the ceremony moving forward. But just beneath that surface, something else had begun, something quiet, something irreversible. And Arthur Hayes remained exactly where he was, as if he had always known this moment would arrive, not with force, not with noise, but with the kind of truth that did not need to be raised to be heard. The breeze shifted slightly, just enough to tug at the loose edge of Arthur's sleeve, and for a brief, unguarded moment, the fabric lifted higher along his wrist, revealing more of the faded ink beneath, not sharp, not decorative, but deliberate, a design that had endured decades without needing explanation. Officer Reynolds noticed it this time, his eyes narrowing as his attention locked onto the marking, curiosity edging into his authority. "What is that?" he asked, his tone no longer purely procedural but tinged with something closer to skepticism. He stepped in half a pace, leaning just enough to get a clearer look. "Some kind of club thing," he added with a faint, dismissive breath, as if the answer had already been decided. Arthur did not pull his sleeve down, did not hide it, but he did not present it either. He simply let the moment exist, his gaze still fixed beyond the officer, still anchored to the ceremony where names continued to rise and fall like a steady current. "It does not mean anything to you," Arthur said quietly, the words even, unprovoked, and somehow more final than any argument could have been. Reynolds let out a short, humorless chuckle, shifting his weight again as if reasserting control over a situation that felt increasingly out of alignment. "Well, it should not be here," he replied, gesturing loosely toward the entrance, toward the families, toward the order he believed he was protecting. Behind them, a few more heads had turned now, the tension no longer subtle, conversations pausing mid-sentence as attention gathered in quiet pockets, drawn not by volume but by the absence of it, by the way the old man refused to react, refused to match the energy being directed at him. Across the field, Captain Brooks had not moved, his phone still in his hand, his eyes fixed on Arthur's wrist. The image of the tattoo now burned clearly into his mind, and on the other end of the silent line, the response had already begun to move, not in words but in action, layers of command shifting, questions becoming confirmations, and confirmations becoming urgency. Brooks could feel it without hearing it, the kind of reaction that did not belong to routine checks or minor clarifications, something deeper, something buried, something that had not been spoken aloud in years. "Stay where you are." The voice finally returned through the phone, low and controlled. "Do not let him leave." Brooks's grip tightened slightly around the device, his posture straightening as the weight of the instruction settled in. He glanced again toward Arthur, who had not taken a single step since the call had begun, who stood with the same quiet patience that now felt less like passivity and more like certainty, as if he had already lived through moments far more uncertain than this one, moments where time stretched longer and the stakes ran deeper. The announcer's voice rose again, clearer now, stronger. "Ethan Hayes," it called, and the name carried across the field with a resonance that seemed to cut through everything else. Arthur's eyes shifted instantly, locking onto the stage, onto the young man stepping forward in perfect form, his uniform immaculate, his posture disciplined, and for the first time since the confrontation began, something changed in Arthur's expression, not outwardly, not enough for most to see, but there, just beneath the surface, a quiet swell of pride, steady and unwavering. Reynolds followed the line of sight, his expression tightening again as if the connection between the two men was now undeniable. "You need to step back," he said once more, but this time the words lacked their earlier certainty, as if something unseen had begun to erode the ground beneath them, because beyond the visible scene, beyond the ordered rows and structured ceremony, something else was already in motion, something moving faster than protocol, faster than assumption, and it was heading directly toward them. The applause rose, strong and steady, as Ethan Hayes stepped forward, his name still echoing faintly through the speakers while he moved with measured precision across the stage, each step aligned with months of discipline, years of preparation, and something deeper that could not be taught, something inherited in ways he did not yet fully understand. His eyes remained forward at first, trained not to break formation, but as he reached the center, as the official extended a hand and the diploma case was presented, there was a flicker, brief but undeniable, his gaze shifting past the line of dignitaries, past the rows of proud families, searching for a face that had always been there in quieter moments. Early mornings, long talks, the kind of presence that did not need recognition to matter, and for a fraction of a second, he saw him, not clearly, not fully, but enough to recognize the silhouette beyond the boundary, enough to feel the distance that should not have existed. His expression did not break, his training held, but something in his eyes changed, something that lingered even as he completed the handshake and turned to exit the stage. Back at the gravel path, Arthur watched without moving, the faintest tightening in his jaw the only sign that the moment had reached him, not as pride alone, but as something heavier, something earned and carried across years that no ceremony could fully capture. Beside him, Officer Reynolds shifted again, his earlier certainty, now worn thin, replaced by a quiet unease that he could not quite name. The tattoo no longer just an odd detail, the old man no longer just an inconvenience. There was a pattern here he could not read, a silence that did not behave the way it should, and it unsettled him. Behind them, Captain Brooks lowered his phone slightly, though the line was still open, still active. His attention now split between the unfolding ceremony and the unseen movement beyond it, the kind of movement that did not announce itself with noise but with change, subtle at first, then undeniable. They are en route. The voice on the other end said, calm but precise. Estimated arrival is under 10 minutes. Brooks's eyes narrowed slightly, absorbing the weight of that statement. 10 minutes was not long, not in ordinary terms. But here, in the middle of a ceremony that was meant to proceed without interruption, it was everything. Understood. He replied quietly, his gaze returning once more to Arthur, who stood exactly as before, as if the passage of time had no effect on him, as if waiting was not a burden but a familiar state. The wind picked up slightly again, carrying with it the distant sound of engines far beyond the field, too faint for most to notice, but enough for Brooks to register, enough for something in his posture to shift almost imperceptibly. Across the seating area, a few heads turned instinctively, not yet understanding why, only sensing that something was approaching, something outside the script of the day. Officer Reynolds glanced briefly toward the horizon, then back at Arthur, his voice lower now, less certain. Sir, if there is something you need to explain, now would be the time. But Arthur did not answer. He simply watched the stage as Ethan returned to his place, diploma in hand, posture straight, unaware that the moment meant for quiet celebration was already beginning to bend towards something far greater, something that would not ask for permission, something that would arrive whether anyone was ready or not. And as the next name was called and the ceremony continued its steady rhythm, the space between what was seen and what was coming grew thinner with every passing second. The sound reached them a few seconds later, low at first, almost mistaken for distant traffic beyond the academy grounds. But it did not fade. It grew, steady and deliberate, a deep mechanical hum that did not belong to a quiet graduation morning. Captain Brooks lifted his head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the far edge of the horizon where heat shimmer blurred the distance. And beneath that shimmer, movement, subtle but unmistakable, a line of dark vehicles approaching with purpose, not fast, not reckless, but precise, controlled, the kind of movement that followed authority rather than asked for it. Around the field, conversations began to fracture, small pockets of attention pulling away from the stage as heads turned in unison, drawn not by curiosity alone but by instinct, the kind that recognized when something significant was about to unfold. Officer Reynolds noticed it too, his posture tightening as he glanced past Arthur toward the approaching line, his earlier confidence now replaced by a flicker of uncertainty that he could not conceal. What is that? He muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. his eyes tracking the vehicles as they neared the perimeter, their dark frames reflecting the sunlight in sharp, clean lines, the kind of vehicles reserved for moments that required more than routine presence. Arthur did not turn to look. He did not need to. The change in the air was enough. The subtle shift in posture from those around him, the quieting of voices, the way the ceremony's rhythm began to lose its seamless flow, all of it spoke clearly without needing confirmation. He remained still, his gaze still fixed toward the stage, where Ethan now stood back in formation, unaware that the world around him was beginning to pivot in a direction no one had anticipated. The announcer hesitated mid-sentence, just long enough for the pause to register, then continued. Though the cadence had changed, the smooth confidence replaced by something slightly strained, as if even the voice over the speakers could feel the shift. At the edge of the field, uniformed personnel began to move, subtle repositioning at first, then more deliberate. Radios lifted, brief exchanges spoken in low tones, instructions passed quickly and quietly, the kind of communication that traveled faster than explanation. Captain Brooks stepped forward now, closing part of the distance between himself and Arthur, his presence no longer that of a distant observer, but something more engaged, more aligned with what was unfolding. The phone still in his hand vibrated once, a single confirmation, and when he glanced down, the message was simple, direct, and carried the kind of weight that removed all doubt. Arrival confirmed. Brooks exhaled slowly, steadying himself as he lifted his gaze again. The vehicles had reached the outer perimeter now, slowing with precise coordination, doors not yet opening, engines idling in controlled patience. The field, once filled with the easy rhythm of celebration, now held a different kind of silence, one that pressed gently but firmly against every person present. Officer Reynolds took a step back without realizing it, his position no longer anchored by certainty, his authority suddenly feeling smaller. Against something he did not yet understand. He glanced at Arthur again, really looked this time, not as a problem, not as an interruption, but as a question he had not known to ask. And Arthur Hayes stood exactly as he had from the beginning, calm, unmoved, as if the approaching moment had never been in doubt, as if everything happening now was simply the next step in a sequence that had been set in motion long before anyone else had noticed. The engines cut almost in unison, and the sudden absence of their low rumble pressed down over the field like a held breath, the kind that comes just before something irreversible happens. Doors opened with controlled precision, not hurried, not hesitant, and from the center vehicle, a figure stepped out, tall, composed, his uniform immaculate in a way that did not need inspection, the 4 stars on his shoulders catching the sunlight with a sharp, unmistakable clarity. And in that instant, the entire perimeter shifted. Officers who had moments ago been managing a ceremony now straightened instinctively, their posture adjusting before their minds could fully process what they were seeing. Captain Brooks moved first, stepping forward with purpose, his path direct, his expression focused, meeting the arriving officer halfway with a crisp salute that was returned without delay. Their exchange brief, quiet, but loaded with meaning that did not need to be spoken aloud. And then the general's gaze moved past him, scanning once, precise and deliberate, until it found the man standing on the gravel path, Arthur Hayes, unchanged, unmoved, as if the arrival had been expected rather than extraordinary. The distance between them was not far, perhaps 20 yards, but the weight of it stretched far beyond measurement. The general began to walk, each step measured, steady, cutting a line through the edge of the gathered crowd. Conversation ceased entirely now, not out of instruction but out of instinct, the kind that recognizes authority at its highest level. Officer Reynolds felt it before he fully understood it, his spine straightening, his breath catching slightly as the realization settled in, his earlier stance dissolving into something closer to uncertainty, even apprehension. He stepped aside without being told, creating space that had not existed moments before. And as the general approached, his eyes never left Arthur, not the crowd, not the ceremony, not the officers attempting to re-establish order, only Arthur, as if everything else had become secondary, irrelevant. The ceremony itself faltered, the announcer's voice trailing off mid-sentence, the rhythm broken completely now. Cadets standing in formation but no longer the focus. because attention had shifted entirely to the unfolding moment at the edge of the field. Ethan Hayes felt it too, though he did not yet understand why, his gaze pulling away from the stage, drawn toward the disturbance, toward the line of movement that led directly to the one figure he had been searching for all morning, his grandfather, and now, something else, someone else, moving toward him with a purpose that commanded the entire space. Captain Brooks fell in a step behind, not leading, not directing, but witnessing, aware that what was about to happen did not belong to protocol or ceremony, but to something far older, far deeper. The general closed the remaining distance, stopping just short of Arthur, close enough now that the details were clear, the weathered suit, the steady posture, and there, just visible beneath the cuff, the faded tattoo that had set everything in motion. For a brief second, no one spoke, no one moved. The field held in a silence so complete it seemed to absorb even the sound of the wind. And then, without hesitation, without announcement, the general's hand rose sharply to his brow in a perfect salute, held with absolute precision, directed not at rank, not at position, but at the man before him. And in that single motion, the entire balance of the moment shifted, not with force, not with noise, but with a truth so clear that no one present could mistake it. The salute did not drop immediately. It held, steady and unwavering, cutting through the stillness with a clarity that no words could match. And for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, no one moved, no one spoke, because what had just happened did not fit within the structure of the ceremony they had come to witness. It did not belong to the script, and yet it carried more authority than anything that had been planned that morning. Arthur Hayes did not return the salute right away. His eyes met the general's, calm, measured, and in that quiet exchange, something passed between them that the rest of the field could not hear, but could unmistakably feel, a recognition that ran deeper than rank, deeper than time, the kind forged in places far removed from polished grounds and formal uniforms. After a brief second, Arthur gave a small nod, not sharp, not formal, but deliberate, and only then did he raise his hand, returning the salute with the same precision, the same quiet authority. And when both hands finally lowered, the silence did not break, it deepened, because now everyone understood that they were witnessing something they had not been meant to anticipate, something that demanded attention without asking for it. General Whitaker took one step closer, his voice low but clear enough to carry across the immediate space. "You should have been seated inside," he said, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as a statement that carried weight beyond protocol. Arthur's expression did not change. "I was fine where I stood," he replied, the words simple, unadorned, and yet they landed with a gravity that caused even those closest to shift slightly, as if the ground beneath them had changed. The general's gaze flicked briefly to the faded tattoo at Arthur's wrist, visible once more in the open air, and for a fraction of a second, something tightened in his expression, not confusion, not doubt, but memory, a memory that did not belong to this place or this time. "Not today," the general said quietly, almost to himself, before turning his head slightly, his voice sharpening just enough to carry authority outward. "This ceremony will pause," he stated, and the effect was immediate. Officers moved. The announcer fell silent, the structured rhythm of the event dissolving into a controlled halt, not chaotic, not disorderly, but undeniably interrupted. Across the field, cadets remained in formation, though their attention had shifted entirely, their focus drawn to the edge where the moment had redefined itself. Ethan Hayes stood among them, his eyes fixed on the scene, the image of his grandfather standing before a 4-star general, not aligning with anything he thought he knew. The distance between them now filled with something far greater than physical space. Officer Reynolds stood frozen where he had stepped back, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet, creeping realization that he had misjudged something fundamental, not just about the man before him, but about the situation itself. Captain Brooks remained still, his role complete, his instincts proven, but even he could feel the weight of what was unfolding, because this was no longer about verification or protocol. This was about recognition, about something long buried rising into the open without warning. General Whitaker turned back to Arthur, his tone steady, controlled. but carrying a depth that the entire field could now sense. "Walk with me," he said, not as an order, but as an invitation that carried the force of both. And for the first time since the morning began, Arthur Hayes moved forward, not hurried, not hesitant, but with the same quiet certainty that had defined him from the start. And as he stepped past the boundary that had held him outside, the line between where he had been allowed and where he belonged disappeared completely. They walked side by side across the field, not hurried, not ceremonial, but with a quiet purpose that drew every eye in their direction, the gravel giving way to the trimmed grass beneath their feet as the boundary that had once separated Arthur from the ceremony dissolved completely, and with each step, the weight of the moment seemed to settle deeper into the air, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. General Whitaker did not speak immediately, his gaze forward, his posture steady, as if allowing the silence itself to carry what words could not, and Arthur matched that silence, his presence unchanged, unaffected by the attention now fixed entirely upon him. As they approached the stage, officers moved instinctively, clearing space without being told, the structure of the ceremony bending around them rather than resisting, and at the front, just below the platform, they stopped, turning together toward the assembled cadets and families, the field now completely still, even the wind seeming to pause as if the moment demanded it. General Whitaker looked out across the rows, his voice measured when it came, carrying easily without force. "There are days when we celebrate achievement," he said, his tone even, controlled. "And there are days when we remember what made those achievements possible." His eyes shifted briefly toward Arthur, then back to the crowd. "Today, we do both." The words settled over the field, not as a speech, but as a recognition, simple and absolute. And then he stepped slightly aside, not announcing Arthur, not explaining him, but creating space, allowing the truth of the moment to stand on its own. Arthur did not step forward onto the stage. He did not seek the center. Instead, he turned his head just enough to find Ethan among the formation, their eyes meeting clearly now. No distance, no obstruction, just recognition. And for the first time since the morning began, Ethan broke his perfect posture, just slightly, his shoulders easing as the realization settled in, not all at once, but in layers. The man he had known as quiet, steady, always present, now standing at the center of something far larger than he had ever imagined. Arthur gave him a small nod, the same one he had given the general, understated, deliberate, and in that gesture, there was pride, not loud, not overwhelming, but grounded, earned, and Ethan responded in kind, his hand rising in a precise, respectful salute, held firm, unwavering, not because it was required, but because it felt right. Arthur did not return the salute this time. He simply held the moment, his eyes steady, acknowledging it without mirroring it, because this was not about rank or formality. It was about something deeper, something carried across generations without words. Around them, the field remained silent, every person present understanding, in their own way, that they were witnessing something rare, something that could not be planned or repeated. Officer Reynolds stood at the edge, his earlier authority replaced by a quiet stillness, his gaze fixed on Arthur with a new understanding, one that did not come from instruction but from experience. Captain Brooks remained nearby, his role complete, his presence now simply part of the moment he had helped uncover, and as the silence stretched, it did not feel empty. It felt full, filled with respect, with recognition, with the quiet acknowledgement of a life that had never asked to be seen and yet could not be overlooked. And after a few seconds that felt far longer, General Whitaker gave a slight nod, the ceremony resuming not with the same rhythm as before, but with a deeper one, a steadier one, as if something fundamental had shifted beneath it, and Arthur Hayes remained where he was, not at the center, not in the spotlight, but exactly where he belonged, present, steady, and finally, unmistakably seen, because respect had not been demanded, it had simply been remembered.